Welcome back to the Big Rethink Interviews. I'm Bryan Alexander, the interviewer for today, and with me is Aras Bozkurt. Hello, Aras.
Hello from Turkey.
Why don't you tell us your title and your institution?
I am an associate professor of distance education and I work at Anadolu University.
Fantastic.
It is a university located between Istanbul and Ankara.
And it has an enormous number of online students.
Yeah, around 3 million. It's generally called as a giga university in the field.
Yes. Fantastic. Well, we have a series of questions to ask, and I think the questions sometimes echo each other or balance each other. So, and in the process of doing these interviews, some of our guests have anticipated some questions. So I may shuffle them around depending on where we go. And these questions are based on looking at this extraordinary year of 2020. So my first question to you is, what are you seeing in higher education as it responds to this year? In the United States, we think particularly of COVID-19, and we think of anti-racist activism. What are you seeing?
Well, this year, it was an amazing year and it started with disasters. Actually, if the historians write a book about 2020, probably there would be many chapters. But before I answer your question, I think I need to provide some background information to better answer your question. By the advent of the internet and computer at 90s, we have observed a drastic change in how we teach and learn, and learning spaces transformed. Distance education has been pronounced as online distance education or online learning, and we've seen a lot of practice of blended learning following the advent of computers and internet. By the new millennium, we've seen that some theoretical views emerged or some others already introduced re-emerged as a result of the need to explain online learning. For instance, cognitive inquiry is a groundbreaking theoretical view, and we've seen that cognitive practice from 1970s was also very helpful to explain online community formation. And then network learning became more important. We talked about connectivism, rhizomatic learning, and MOOCs. As a result of capacity increase in accessibility options, openness in education has become an important issue, and we have been talking about open education practice and open education resources now. In brief, what I want to say, even in the recent history of educational technology, distance education, or online learning, there were some significant causes and results. Yet, these were mostly about pedagogical issues. When we look at to your original question, COVID-19 and Black Lives Matter movement, I think we've been going through a transformational change in society. I mean, its effects are broader and not limited to higher education. The things, I've just explained, if you look at them closely, we see that their effects were mostly educational, pedagogical, but both these events are affected all the society, and it will change many things. I personally believe that so far we blindly worked on pedagogical issues and ignored one of the three aspects of learning. It is the social thing.
Mm-hmm.
In many articles, we say learning is a social process, and we cite Bandura or, some other known authors. But, sometimes I think telling that learning is social, we just use it for lip service. When I refer to social aspects, I don't mean only interaction and communication, but I want to talk about care and affection.
Mm.
I think we limited learning to cognitive aspects and focused on, let's say, what's happening in our brains. However, we forget that learners also have hearts, and both COVID-19 and Black Lives Matter reminded us, without touching learners' hearts and souls, learning cannot truly happen in their brains and cognitive. And we just did that by saying learning is a social process and blah, blah, blah. I think that doesn't work. And maybe in the US context, I was following the recent events. Black Lives Matter are meaningful and it's a significant event. But when you come to European or Asian context, the case of refugees are more meaningful because actually problems are very similar, but the actors are different. The problem is global, but the examples are contextual. We suffer from COVID-19. We have seen that Black people were treated unfairly, but what about Syrian refugees or girls in the middle of civil wars in Africa or in the Middle East? What I mean, we have realized that there's a global problem in educational landscape, but there isn't a single formula to solve all of them. And the solution is beyond conventional pedagogical approaches. So yes, we need pedagogy, but I think it is now right time to cover, other aspects like care and emotion.
Thank you. That's a very powerful answer. I really appreciate how you broke out the different national and continental experiences. I think you'll find that the faculty and students in our program, and I think most of the viewers and listeners will nod appreciatively when you say that 2020 reminds us to pay attention to the heart, not just to the mind.
Yeah.
That was a qualitative question and a very richly qualitative answer. Now I'd like to shift to a more quantitative question. As you observe the transformation of higher education, what metrics do you track? What trends do you think we should track?
It's a tough question.
Mm.
Well, for metrics, actually, I don't have many things to say, but I can say that higher education needs new business models. I mean, when I say business models, it's more about management and strategic planning, but about funding, especially those like in the US and England, where international students constitute a great majority of learners. These universities, these higher education institutions need to develop new business models to survive. But as I told earlier, these are metrics, but if you look at the trends, I think higher education also now aware of the importance of pedagogy of care and maybe a trauma-informed pedagogy, because when you lose your international students, we don't need to count them only as numbers, but we have to consider the other aspect of their problems.
Well, it's going to be tricky to balance that. Thank you.
You're welcome.
But you did provide one metric already, which was the sheer enrollment of your university.
Sorry?
You provided one metric already, the sheer enrollment of your university.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. Well, let's look a little further ahead and look at the future of higher education, and wonder what are some of the long-term changes that we should expect for higher education. And I get thinking about European and Asian higher education, as well as higher education worldwide. I mean, what is 2020 going to do to us to change us for the future?
This answer will be a global one, I think. You know the story of the Cinderella, maybe. Yeah. As in the story of Cinderella,
Yes,
when the
yes.
when the clock hit 12, the golden carriage turned into a pumpkin, and all the truths were revealed. In our current case, by the COVID-19, it affected all the world. When the clock hit 12, I think higher education turned into a pumpkin, and we now have real experience regarding where we failed. And maybe, our new research agenda should focus on these issues.
Mhm.
Apart from that, I see that, there are a lot of discussions orbiting around two options. Some people still thinking going back to the face-to-face education, or they are discussing will we continue to practice online distance education. But the what I see is there are two options: face-to-face and online learning. My feeling is that both of these options indicate a binary solution. I mean, we are forced to choose black and white, but I believe that blended and hybrid learning modes will gain more momentum in a longer term. Probably some learners will prefer staying in the gray zone rather than, going to face or online. So I would say in a longer term, in a long run, blended learning will gain more importance.
Very good. Thank you. That's a really solid answer. And that's one that I personally find quite believable. Um, let me ask now the biggest question I can ask, which is how do you see these changes, shifting more towards blended and hybrid, for example, the intersecting with other large trends? I'm thinking, for example, about climate change. I'm thinking about globalization or anti-globalization. I'm thinking about economic inequality. I mean, how do you see these huge trends colliding and producing new futures?
Um, yeah, I think that's a big question, and we need not hours but days to discuss this question. But I would say, during the pandemic in Turkey, we had curfew and lockdown days. I was I stayed at home like 2 weeks or 3 weeks without going outside.
Mm.
And when I went to a green park, I realized that, it is not the park I left a few weeks ago. It was really greener. I mean, then I realized that there is a problem with the humans themselves. I think, COVID-19 was a kind reminder for the truth that hurts. That's my personal view. I am really a fan of the movie Matrix. Did you have opportunity to watch it?
Of
Uh,
course.
there was a conversation in that movie between Agent Smith and I think the other one was Morpheus. Accordingly, Agent Smith was originally, he was a bot and saying that he classified every mammal on the earth, and he observed that every mammal placed themselves into their ecosystem and instinctively serve to sustain it. But
Yes.
humans, they are different. They consume all the resources, and to survive, they move another area and consume it again. He was saying that there was another organism on our world with the same pattern, and he
Cancer
was the virus. And
virus.
during the lockdown days, I just remembered that scene, and when you say climate change, I see, humans, including myself, as a virus. Actually, we don't treat the mother world as what it deserves, and we don't do that. Anyway, My another observation was as long as we stay away from the nature, it renews itself, and I could see that it can heal itself without our help. Sometimes, we say that we are saving the nature, but we are terminating it. At the same time, we are trying to save it. It's a dilemma. I mean, that's a dilemma that I couldn't solve.
Mm.
We don't help it. We hurt it, and we honestly should stop that. If I integrate to this learning in a project last year, people were talking about green ICT, and maybe this can be relevant to your question.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, climate change is a trend, but from the perspective of online learning, we can focus on green ICT because in a longer term, what we do now to go green will echo in our world. Therefore, I believe that we should work on go green options, but I say that I just predict we will use more computers and our screens will be on for a long time. These are minor details, but even in a few days lockdowns, I see that these minor details have a lot of effect on the nature.
These are fantastic details, and thinking about what green ICT is a great, deep question. Thank you. I would love to follow up on that, but I have other questions to ask you.
Sure.
And thank you for the Matrix reference. That's one of my favorite scenes. And Smith says, "And I am the cure."
Honestly, I still watch Matrix, and there are a lot of metaphors or myths in that movie. Each time I watch it, I discover something new.
It's fantastic. I taught it in a class, and it's just, I just love it. So we have a different question, which is kind of echoes your experience when you went back to that park and you saw that it was really green. What has the crisis of 2020 revealed about higher education? I don't mean for a handful of people, but that, what ideas, what truths have become obvious to everybody. You earlier said that globally we've seen inequalities occur in education across different lines from nation to nation. Is that one of the things that has been revealed, or is there anything else that we should look to?
For this question, I have an exact answer. The crisis revealed inequality, and social injustice is a reality of our lives. I mean, both COVID-19 and Black Lives Matter movement already showed this reality. Well, if we look at the roots of these problems we've been talking about, we will see that at the core of these problems is our ignorance. I mean, these are not new problems, but I think we prefer to ignore them. I think that was our mistake. Inequality and injustice. In a recent study with many co-authors from all around the world, we wrote that article during the lockdown days when the numbers were at their peak. It was a piece entitled "A Global Outlook to the Interruption of Education Due to COVID-19 Pandemic." In this study, we gathered a total of 31 country cases from 6 continents. And it is an article, but it has, I think, 126 pages or something. It's a long one. In this study, the global outlook showed us inequality, and injustice are major issues everywhere. And there were interesting examples, and I was shocked and felt really saddened when I read these stories from different cases. For example, can you imagine an international student stuck in a foreign country, or another student in Europe was working and living 9-meter square houses, and these students lost their job, left their school, and they have to survive during these hard times alone. Alone, both physically and socially, in these 9 meters square rooms. And you know, this was not in the study, but there was another study that I read, written by Chinese researchers. I have heard some stories about people who suicided because of the high psychological pressure and anxiety derived from COVID-19 pandemic. Besides, there are many other students who were not able to continue their education because they didn't have basic tools like a decent computer or stable Wi-Fi connection.
Yeah.
You know, we suddenly pivoted to online, and my first impression was, yeah, we did it. But I have seen that, I have witnessed that so-called technology-centric solutions, purely technological solutions, didn't solve their problem, but caused some other bigger problems. Therefore, I think the inequality and injustice issues are bigger than we assume, and we really need to focus on these issues. And this is my personal feeling and my personal opinion. I think we closed our eyes for a long time, and we failed many of the learners before the COVID-19 crisis. Yes, a lot of things happened with the pandemic, but the pandemic was not the reason of these problems about inequity, injustice problems, but that they just revealed them. I mean, they were already there. They were already existing problems.
Yes. And that's what was revealed. Thank you. That's a very, very clear answer. And that may be the agenda for the next generation of higher education worldwide.
Truly, you know, actually, you know, I told briefly about some stories, and they are mostly about injustice and inequality and inequality.
Mm-hmm.
And I was shocked to read these stories because most of these stories were coming from developed countries, and I wasn't expecting them. You know, by default, we always assume that, you know, such problems are belong to some countries or some territories, but the reality is not that. The problem is everywhere. This is the what COVID-19 crisis taught us by experience. You know, there are problems, and you cannot close your eyes. We have to find solutions.
Let's see what we can do. That actually leads to the next question. This is where we narrow our questions a bit more. And we take a look at a slice of higher education. And I'd like to ask about instructional design as a profession. So these are people who in March and February, depending on where you were, did an awful lot of work to help transition higher education to online. And we ask about this in part because the graduate program that the Big Rethink is part of, some of the students come to us from instructional design, and some graduate to work in instructional design. So this is a dear question for a lot of our students. What can instructional design contribute to this crisis of higher education right now?
As we all witness, you know, instructional designers, especially those experts on online education, they became very valuable during the crisis. But many of the higher education institutions didn't invest on them, and there were just fewer of them, and they really worked a lot. Like the doctors and nurses at hospitals, they were trying to put the content to online spaces to ensure the continuity of education. So their roles were very critical, and probably after this point will be more critical. During the emergency remote education practices, actually, we have seen that most of the people really don't know what is online learning. And another observation, there were many experts. Everybody was telling tips and tricks about online learning. But I've seen that, they don't have a lot of experience, and they don't know the essence of online education. At this point, instructional designers, or sometimes people call them as learning designers, have a critical role, because what they design will echo on learner side. So the decisions they take are very important. Uh, you know, I'm just teasing, but I will just give a brief lecture on distance education and online learning. In distance education 101 course, we say uploading slides to online space are not distance education or online learning. And this was one of the biggest mistake that I've seen all around the world. Another thing, I would say, if we assume that if we put online content to online space and we did something online, it's similar to putting a book and a student into a physical class and expect that learning will happen by itself. That will not work. Probably that will not work. And another problem I was observed during the crisis was the imitation of the face-to-face education. Especially in many European countries, people just imitated what they did in face-to-face classes in online classes. For instance, if you have a 3 hours face-to-face course, you don't need to hold a 3 hours webinar, but people were doing that. And probably you heard, people were talking about Zoom fatigue or something.
Yes.
As it was obvious from these examples, the role of instructional designers are very critical. And the biggest contribution among many things would be designing learning spaces that eliminate transactional distance. In the examples that I've just explained, they were bad examples, but without critical decisions or right decisions by the instructional designers, we see that the storm will be harsher and worse. So we have to be very careful. And, my experience and my observation told me that transactional distance is very important, something ignored in many practices, but we have to focus on, maybe your students should focus on transactional distance. When I say transactional distance, I mean psychological distance, cultural distance, emotional distance, and socioeconomic distance. Without removing this kind of transactional barriers, we are much likely to fail at this point, and instructional designers can step in at this point.
Yes.
And also, as I mentioned earlier, pedagogy of care is very important. And I think we don't need to design learning just for educational and pedagogical objectives, but we have to always remember that learners are humans with hearts and souls. If we cannot invade their hearts and souls, we cannot access their brains and cognitive dimensions. So we have to always take these aspects into account.
Thank you. That's I think your point about transactional distance is one that we really, really can use well. Thank you.
For transactional distance, I can say that yes, now I refer to online distance education, but I truly believe that even in the face-to-face education, if you cannot provide an effective, if you cannot remove these transactional barriers, learning will barely happen. So this is valid for online education and face-to-face education.
Very good. It really does apply to everything. This is a kind of revolution in instructional design. We have a question about another slice of higher education, which has to do with science. You know, globally, we're experiencing this interesting moment where one part of science, epidemiology, is now, and public health in general, are now crucial to our thinking and our practice. On the one hand, we have a greater role for public health and medical science in our lives. On the other hand, we have opposition to science. We're seeing this in the United States, but we're seeing this in other countries in different ways. And I'm curious, what does this year, what do the events of 2020, what do they tell us about how academics create science and convince people to pay attention to it? What does it tell us about how we communicate science to the world?
As far as I understand from this question, you imply how can scientific or scholarly language can be understood by everyone, right?
Yes, the language is a key part, yeah.
I would say unknown creates fear, and many of the scientific outputs are not understood, and it's unknown if you are out of the circle, academic circle. Sometimes, my friends who are working in different sectors say congrats for a new article. I publish to promote my article in social media, but they note that it's too complex for them to understand. What I do is writing blogs as an extension. Sometimes I summarize my major findings in a general language without following academic jargon or APA rules. And in a center I've just assigned, we plan to record videos of the articles, and we would like to summarize them in 60 seconds in a tone and language that everybody can understand. I think clear and understandable communication will eliminate these problems. So that would be one thing. I believe that, in the scientific world, sometimes we speak in an echo chamber. It's difficult to understand by others. So we have to simplify it to disseminate the real message. If we don't simplify it, it will be too complex for many people.
Thank you. That's good advice. Now let me look at another slice of higher education, and it's one that you've touched on before, and that's the digital divide between those who have access to broadband and to hardware and to software and understanding skills, and those who do not. You mentioned this before, how populations around the world didn't have, as you said, stable Wi-Fi or access to the digital world. What can we do about that? What do you think is going to happen over the next few years with the digital divide?
Oh gosh, a few years ago, I have written a book chapter about digital divide in Turkish.
Oh.
And that time, I never thought, I was talking about that it's a potential problem, but uh, I didn't think that it's a problem that a bigger problem than I was expecting. To my surprise, that's a huge problem. As I mentioned earlier, in a global
Yes.
study on COVID-19 and interruption of education, the digital divide was another issue that we observed in many countries. Frankly, I wasn't expecting to see the digital divide in developed countries, especially in European context, but no matter they are developing or developed, it is still a huge problem. Um, One of the report in this study, it was from South Korea, and they did something different from other countries as a part of emergency remote education. I really admired their approach to the situation. When they implemented emergency remote education, they provided different entry points, like fully online, blended, and traditional offline modes with
Mm.
spreadsheets and textbooks. I think this is too practical to eliminate digital divide, and considering that learning is a journey, we have to provide different roads like online, offline, or something blended. Um, if we can ask how learners move forward and provide some options, and maybe if we provide them different entry points, uh, that would not totally terminate the problem of digital divide, but that would probably lessen it. On the other hand, I also know that it's not as easy as we speak now, because uh, providing different options means recruiting more faculty members, taking different instructional designers to, I mean, you have to give them salary, you have to invest for the infrastructure. And I see that these decisions are not taken for educational purposes, and sometimes financial concerns hinders us from doing these ideal things. Yes, in South Korea they did, but while it is possible to reduce digital divide, it's not possible for practical reasons. I mean, financial reasons in
Sure.
all around the world.
Sure. That's going to be a huge limitation. Um, I love that phrase about learning as a journey, and that we should provide different roads for it. Um, that's a really good image for this. But we've reached the end of our journey for this hour, I'm afraid. You have given such thoughtful answers, answers relying on your perspective and also on your research. Is there anything else you'd like to add about the subject that we haven't touched on?
Um, I think I can add some further remarks in our last final question.
Please.
Referring to COVID-19 crisis, we've seen the emerging educational roles of the parents.
Mm.
Speaking for the general educational landscape, especially in K-12, parents were forced to take some educational roles, and this was really difficult for them, especially for those who also kept on working at homes or at offices during the pandemic time. So the question would be, these educational roles should be equipped only by educators, or should they be shared, or should we give the learners more responsibility? One of my other observation was that those students who come from teacher-centered educational traditions, especially in Turkey, had difficult times to navigate during the crisis, because
Mm. Mm.
they strongly needed someone to guide them and help them. I think parents played a significant roles at this point, but I think the way we share educational responsibilities should be redistributed in the normal or new normal. There is a need to redistribute to the educational roles, and we have to think about that. Second, I would like to talk about the educational roles of the institutions. This is an observation from the study I mentioned. I realized that schools or universities are not only physical buildings. In fact, they are more than physical constructs. In many cases, these buildings were places where students would socialize, get guidance, and even in many countries, they were the places where they can eat proper food. And the closure of the schools prevented, all these opportunities for the students. So, of course, we cannot provide proper food in online education, but we should work on developing online learning spaces beyond delivering educational content, but also provide some social needs of the learners. And when I say that, I definitely don't mean adding discussion forums. I mean, we have to do more than that. Discussion forums are practical, but they are not the only solution. Third, I've talked about transactional distance.
Mm-hmm.
It is actually a theory of distance education and online learning, but without eliminating the psychological distance, you cannot be successful in any learning mode. So I think instructional designers, both for online distance education and face-to-face education, would focus on transactional distance. And I think we have to put trauma-informed pedagogy as a part of the normal curriculum, because there are a lot of problems. Yes, we talk about problem of the Black people or problem of the learners during the COVID-19 crisis, but the problem is not limited to them. There are, for example, homosexual students with different preferences, and maybe this is not a problem in the US. I mean, it's not a big, huge problem, but when you come to the Asia, that's a huge problem. This was what I was talking about. The problems are named differently, but I mean, there is a global problem, but if we contextualize them, they are entitled with different names, and we have to focus on them. As a final word, I can say that in a recent article in Turkish, I commented that I hope I can translate in a proper way. During the pandemic and after the pandemic, individuals started to wear masks, but the educational system has become unmasked, and we had the opportunity to see many flaws of the educational system.
Yes.
And we have to work on these flaws, and the future plans should not be lip service projects. Otherwise, sometime in the near future, if we hold a similar meeting in next year or in a near future, if we really focus on and work on these problems, it is possible that we will discuss the same things.
That's a very, very powerful set of observations, both on the importance of home life and how we should redistribute educational roles in the new normal, but also how we should change educational institutions, that social support, the trauma-informed pedagogy. Just one small question about that. In terms of technology, you mentioned that discussion threads or discussion boards are okay, but we should go beyond that. What are you thinking beyond that? What kind of tools or what kind of platforms?
There are many studies that actually, discussion forums, to me, I find it kind of Western-oriented solution. In international learning settings, if you use a discussion forum, you will see that some of the learners from different nations or continents
Mhm.
refrain themselves to communicate, because communication is something cultural, and just putting a discussion forum is not a solution. In Turkey, similar to all around the world, people are using learning management systems. There are studies that showing effectiveness of discussion forums, but in Turkey, it doesn't work. And in many countries with different cultural backgrounds, and what I do in my courses, for
Mhm.
example, I always use a friendly tone. I mean, discussion forum is not the only space that I communicate with my learners. I create sometimes WhatsApp groups just to say good morning, how are you, how is going on. I mean, I don't use these WhatsApp groups to give them assignments. Do you understand what I mean? I just try to build a social setting that they can communicate just normal. I mean, sometimes they comment on the movies, or
Mhm.
they comment on something else. Maybe the problem with the the mistake we do in online education is that we expect that discussions should be oriented on educational purposes. Consider your face-to-face classrooms. You talk about everything. You make jokes. You smile them. We should do that similar things in online learning environments, and this is what I mean. And we should go beyond discussion forums.
I agree. I agree. That's yeah, as long as I've been online, there's always been informal discussion that's part of it's part of the formal space. Um, you know, I may follow up with you on this personally. Every semester I rethink my technology strategy, and I may ask you for your advice. But in the meantime, I have to thank you. This has been a tremendous, nearly 1 hour of conversation. You've been a very generous interviewee. Your answers are thoughtful. They reflect your great perspective as well as your great research. Thank you so much, Aras. Thank you very much.
It was a pleasure to join the conversation with you. Thank you.